Welcome to another Gestalt IT Roundtable. My name is Tom Hollingsworth, and I am an analyst here at Gestalt IT. And each time we bring you one of our special roundtable episodes, we like to discuss a topic that's of interest to the enterprise IT practitioner. And we've got a great one today because we're going to be talking about all things automation, a few things cloud, and possibly some gotchas that you need to be worried about. But I first want to take a moment to introduce our panelists so that they can kind of give you an idea of who they are before we move into the topic, starting with Chris.
Yeah, my name's Chris Grundeman. I'm a consultant, content creator, coach, and mentor, and you can learn more at chrisgrundeman.com.
All right, Calvin.
Yeah, I'm Calvin Hendricks Parker. I am CTO and co-founder of 6 Feet Up. We are a cloud and Python consulting company based out of Indiana, but we are worldwide. You can find us at 6feetup.com/blog.
All right, and our special guest from BlueCat, Andrew.
Andrew Wordkin. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at BlueCat, focused on our product and market strategy and partnerships, and really spend most of my time with our customers trying to make sure that we stay ahead of them. And I can be reached at a Wordkin on Twitter.
All right, thank you all for joining us today. Let's jump into this roundtable topic because it was kind of an interesting one that we were discussing here this week. We're talking about things related to automation, and I'm a networking guy by trade, and for the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, all I've heard is how automation is going to take my job away. How I'm going to be replaced by a very convenient shell script, probably running in Python, and an API is going to replace my desk, and well, I probably just need to look at going to, I don't know, truck driving school or open a food truck. But it turns out that that's not quite as easy as you might think, because it is very simple to start using API calls to replicate a lot of the things that we've done. It turns out, though, that IT practitioners have a little bit more knowledge than your average Python script. And that's one of the roadblocks that we're starting to see as companies are journeying into the cloud more and more, and they're trying to enable a lot of these services that are being offered by a variety of companies out there. It turns out that your average IT practitioner not only knows how to do things, they also know when to do them and when not to do them. And we wanted to talk a little bit about that today. So I'm actually going to start with Calvin, because Calvin, you are effectively kind of our representative of the developer community here. And I know that we've been spending months and months and years just saying, listen, I just need an API and I need a Python library, and the world's going to be rosy and everything's going to work magically and it's all going to be automated and you never have to worry about it again. It's not quite that easy, though, is it?
No, I would agree. But although, Tom, I would definitely visit your food truck if you were to start a food truck. It is a tricky environment out there because there is so much tribal knowledge baked into the operations aspect of deploying, running, and delivering a software application, whether it's in the cloud or in your data center or on bare metal someplace. I think what's important to remember here is that you're not going to be taking away like these. Obviously I'm very pro automation. I'm the developer guy in the room. I'm all about infrastructure as code. I'm all about writing Python, but I'm really about the delivery of the application. And I think that the operations folks who are maybe fearful that their jobs may be taken away by automation, that's not how I look at it or how they should be looking at it. I hope they're not, because really what's happening is it is opening up like so many brain cycles now to put toward innovation and actually sharpening those skills and extending their reach into what in the cloud or in technology that they can really do. I think no one wants to shell into a box anymore and app to upgrade packages and deal with networking by hand. That's not the part we're trying to that is the part we're trying to replace. That is not the part that you want to be doing anyway. I think the interesting parts are really, how do I grow my skill set? How do I become a better version of me? And how do I take this, that knowledge of the applications, the conventions that are kind of passed down as like lore inside of the enterprise? That stuff has to be either encoded, embedded into the automations themselves, and it doesn't work just to document them, because who's reading the documentation anymore?
I love the fact that you refer to it as lore, like it's some kind of massive tome that sits next to the DR plan. It's covered in 6.5 inches of dust that nobody's ever touched. But one of these days, when a random thing goes wrong, you have to send like the junior admin down there to, fight off the dragon that guards the data center, and then they retrieve the tome. And they're like, oh yeah, turns out that when you name something that, it causes all kinds of massive problems. So don't ever name things that.
But it's true, like those crazy conventions. Like, how many times have you run across that where specific IPs are reserved for specific services, like all the DNS servers end in .53, and you're like,
Mhm.
okay, it kind of made sense at the time, but you try to scale that. I mean, that as you grow your business and grow this application, if you have any level of success, that doesn't work.
And where do you record that? Because I'm sure that there are still a lot of companies out there that believe that IP address management is the IPAM Excel spreadsheet that sits somewhere in a long forgotten folder on somebody's desktop. And boy, I hope you updated it the last time you added a system to the network. Chris, you and I kind of have that networking background as well. And I can remember, one of the challenges that I had with automation when I first started dealing with it before I left the practitioner world was the idea that things could happen rapidly. Because I can still remember, okay, I'm going to update the routing tables on this device and in this network, and then I'm going to go get some coffee because OSPF needs to take about a half an hour to chill out. And this is my chance to caffeinate. How are you seeing this tug of war between the need to get things done right now and this institutional knowledge we have of, yeah, protocols don't quite work like that?
It's definitely an interesting dynamic, and you're right. There are a lot of protocols that need some time, right? And so whether it's draining traffic off an OSPF link, or doing the same thing with a BGP link, or updating your DNS records and waiting for TTLs around the world to propagate. There's definitely some delay built in there. But I think more than that, I kind of want to go back to this original question of are there folks out there that are really still at this point, right, and whatever this is now, middle of 2021, that are worried about their jobs going away due to automation? Because I think that at this point, it's at least clear to me and most of the folks that I talk to that there's more work to be done out there than there are people to do it. And the only way we're going to even keep ourselves sane is by going pretty deep into automation. And this is something that's not even new, right? I think that big networks, right, especially service providers, which is kind of where I cut my teeth, we were using shell scripts, and it wasn't Python, it was Perl at the time. But we were writing a lot of automation in shell scripts and Perl, and this was 15, 20 years ago. And so it's newer to networks, maybe in some of the enterprise and definitely SMB. But I think we have to look at our role as a manager of bots almost. And to Calvin's point, right? You really don't want to be manually hand bombing information from one system to another, trying to find the right spreadsheet and pulling this across. So even without those protocol delays that are built in, I think we have to look at automation as a panacea. And I think the trouble we run into is by stopping at that point. Right. And what I mean by that point is that simple shell script, right? So, okay, I need to do this thing 50 times. It's easier for me to write a script than to do it 50 times. And so, a lot of folks can get to that level of automation. And the problem, I think, is the next step, which is, okay, what happens if, I have to do this thing 50 times, but there's actually 48 different variations? And I have to pull information from somewhere else, right? Or I need to do this 300 times, and I've got to build in those timers to wait for things. Or I have to check the list under the dragon to make sure that this name isn't being used somewhere else. And that's where I think some of the really multidimensionality of operations in IT starts to show itself and starts to become a problem. And what I mean by that is we're not talking about binary white-black choices here, or red-green or blue-yellow. What we're talking about is, what does traffic look like on this link on Tuesdays at 2 p.m.? And, how many applications are requiring IPs from this pool on Thursdays in December at 2:45 a.m., right? And there's a bunch of dimensions to the way that IT systems work. And most of that is what's buried in people's heads. That's that lore you're talking about, I think, right? Which is all of these different dimensions that affect each other in multiple different ways. And that's what makes full on automation of everything really, really, really hard.
I'll say that there's even on top of that, I think, an opportunity here to take that lore, and even those people who have that kind of baked into their heads and kind of know what they think they know what's going on, they don't. I mean, this is where an area where anomaly detection, leveraging some modern technologies around machine learning has finally come to a cost-effective point where I could send them many of those logs through some kind of a model and actually get back your action on that kind of information without even a human being in the loop. Now, it's even better to use that to augment the human's capabilities and make us just shine, like really not have to understand it, but know that like that traffic shouldn't have been going over there. Someone's watching for me. Well, the models are watching for me and actually making decisions on my behalf, and reacting faster than maybe I could have.
It's just going back to one thing Chris said, because I think it's exactly right. You can't, I mean, enterprises cannot keep up with the velocity of change today if their strategy is to get a help desk ticket, open a CLI or some user interface, and do these things one at a time. So one needs to automate, which leads to sort of like the first stage of automation, which is, the IT professional can't possibly keep up with the pace of change, and so therefore I'm going to automate for myself. The next step, which is critical to reach the developer and others, is to automate for them. So we think of it at BlueCat as like our customers' customers, and to make sure that the developer deploying an application can use those APIs, which is different than automating so I can deal with my help desk tickets or wherever they might come in, because I know the esoteric stuff. Like I write a bunch of scripts that literally only I can run or me and my team can run, because the arguments to the script are such that you need to understand how the stuff works, versus I just want to add a host record, or I want to provision a couple of IP addresses. I don't care how it works, but I need the IP addresses. And if this API needs to go check a bunch of things, and I can't have it fail. I certainly can't have it waste 15 minutes of my time and then fail. So that's sort of the next level. And I sort of look at it those in terms of automation adoption. Are you automating for yourself, or are you automating for those that need to use the infrastructure? And so from a skill set standpoint, it's more than just automation. It's more than trying to get some of the tribal knowledge or esoteric or vendor specific stuff out of the API. It's also ensuring that the infrastructure you have can change at the rate necessary to support your internal customers. And that requires architecture and plan, all of this stuff that these guys have, years and years of skill doing, so with the right mindset, I think this is just a massive opportunity to become more relevant, versus, and I know there's not a lot of people left that think this way, but you certainly run into them that like, okay, but if everybody knew how to do this, then what would I do? I wouldn't have a job anymore. Like that view, sells oneself short.
I think that's a huge problem that we face in the industry, is because that institutional knowledge that everybody has been basically kind of our, I don't know, get out of jail free card when it comes to dealing with, well, people or things that want to take our job. Well, I'm the only one who knows how to do this. Or, in the case of like a DDI infrastructure, I'm the only one that remembers the naming convention for the servers. I'm the one that has the password to the Excel doc where all the IP addresses are stored.
Right.
Thankfully, we've gotten away from that with the HCP, at least on that other D part. But I wonder if part of the reason why it's so difficult for these to be able to capture this institutional knowledge that we've seen all over the place is because it's been held so closely for so long that it kind of has evolved into this untellable story, as it were. And we see this reflected all the time when it's like, oh, you're installing a printer on that network, you need to go talk to Bob over there because he knows it better than anybody else. And we never get that knowledge transfer unless that person leaves the job or they are promoted to a point where they need to let go of it in order to be able to move forward. And so we're not able to capture that. We've focused so much on business rules, so we can only do these things with these devices or keep them under these costs, that we never learned about operations rules, like don't put these printers on this subnet, or don't build a snowflake VM in AWS that can never move anywhere else, because that's going to break all of our operations systems in the event that, I don't know, US East 1 goes down. So is it that it's not that we don't know how to extract the information, it's that we don't know what information we need to extract?
Well, I think it's a little you're talking about the best case scenario. If the person gets promoted or leaves, that they actually do document what that part of the process. I think that's even highly unlikely. And I think what Andrew mentioned about the architecture there, I think the applications have to be thought about differently, because we're in a bigger world of scale. We're not in the world where you could just run a giant relational database and it solved all your problems because all you had to do was keep throwing more and more hardware at that one single like vertical stack of an application. There's so much more data being generated in the world today, and your applications they have to be thought about differently to be able to handle that level of scale, that level of growth, and that level of throughput of data that's going through them. You have to think everything dynamically. You have to think everything is maybe even stateless.
It was, going back years, like when I was building enterprise software outside of networking, and, we'd go to try to sell to a new customer. Two things, like we weren't selling to IT, and our strategy was like leave IT out of it until the business completely bought in, because when IT gets involved, we're going to slow down. It wasn't because they were slow, because that's when you got the 83-page network requirements document, and with this basic idea that the application needs to meet the company's requirements, those are fixed. The network's not going to change. So your application better work over this 56K link and over this and over this and over this. To the world today, where obviously the application is king and the rest of the infrastructure needs to be bendable, malleable, changeable, it needs to be able to meet the needs of the application. And it's really flipped. And everybody needs to be looking at sort of the application and services that companies are building, which are less predictable, by the way. So you get to this horrible position of I need to meet the unpredictable demands of the business at some predictable level of cost, while ensuring security and reliability and governance and any other HIPAA, any other rules, compliance rules I might need. So it's a challenge to think that way, but that's the shift. It can't be like, no, we can't take your application because it's too heavy on the bandwidth side. It's those discussions don't happen anymore.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Andrew. And I agree with it wholeheartedly. And I actually would go a step further to say that I think that the thing that a lot of my colleagues or my former colleagues and some of the traditional kind of IT operations folks, and especially network folks, are actually afraid of isn't that automation is going to take their job away. It's that their job has changed and they have to deal with the reality you just described, which is I can no longer just like build this thing and tell everyone else to deal with it. I actually have to be changing what I built on a potentially daily, definitely weekly or monthly or quarterly basis as the needs of the business change, because now what I'm building is so crucial to the business that it's actually flipped over somehow in this strange way. And I think that's actually the thing that makes some traditional folks kind of shy away from automation. Isn't that they think it's taking their jobs, but that they realize that it's vastly changed what it is that they do and how they have to do it and the timelines they need to do it on, potentially. So, I mean, I guess the question then becomes like, how do we help support that, right? How do you actually make that work in a way where, you don't have to call Carl about the fourth floor printer network? Because to Calvin's point, when Carl leaves, you don't just all of a sudden know how to put the printer on that network. You stop putting printers on that network.
Yeah, it's definitely
Maybe you just stop printing.
I agree with you on that one, Andrew.
Yeah.
Printers. There was a good tweet today that everyone said you need to modernize, and it's the telephone company said, "Yeah, let's all modernize. Got cool devices now." And computers were like, "Yeah, we're all going to modernize." Printer companies are like, "No." I was going to bring up there's really a change management issue too. I mean, from the human standpoint and from a technology standpoint, how do you roll out these new changes? I mean, what you just said, Chris, makes total sense. Like, there's no such thing as an application you can just set and forget. I mean, some external force is going to basically ensure that you see bit rot in some way. Some failure is going to creep into the system, and it's not maybe from the code that you wrote or deployed or the application you bought from some vendor, but it's because the frame size changed, or the the switching now is going a different direction, or whatever. There's some external force that's going to act on it that that application, not your application, was depending on some behavior external to itself to be successful, that you can be guaranteed it's going to change and will fail.
Unless it was running on like a VAX or an AS400 or something, but 100% correct. I once had the problem of trying to shut down a VAX application. We couldn't figure out how to do it. But the from a change management standpoint, that's for certain the other big difference, right? Because you're like the whole tenet of like CI/CD and what we're trying to do with cloud development is if lots of small releases are easier to deal with than these big bang, I'm going to change a bunch of stuff and I'm going to reserve Sunday at 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. because that's when my business allows, and there's some Six Sigma black belt there, and I have my processes for both implementing it and for undoing it in case there's a problem, and it's got to go away, and that's part of what causes a lack of automation. I mean, we had a customer a few years ago where we implemented um, all this awesome automation, and the business would not accept it because it didn't meet their change management requirements. And they eventually changed the change management requirements, but those did not allow them to make these changes. Manual inspections were necessary. So there's a modernization of processes, especially around change management, that's necessary. In order to pull that off, though, you need to be able to trust the data, and so, like, from an IPAM standpoint, that means the data better be correct because you're about to provision this subnet or you're about to occupy these IP addresses, and if the data that you're using as a reference to make those changes to is wrong, then you can't guarantee it's correct, and so in order to modernize change management, it's not just about, hey, we'll have automated approvals, great, but how can you assert that what you're doing is correct? And then once it's done, how do you assert that it worked without having manual inspection or steps that are timely? And that's a part of automation that people often don't think about. I mean, when I put my software developer hat back on, which I try to leave on as much as possible, but it's to some extent, you think of things like test-driven development. I mean, okay, I'm going to go change these things. How can I then also assert that it changed, propagated appropriately, that the change worked? And I think when we think of automation, oftentimes we're thinking about just the change and not assuring that the change was valid.
I think it comes down to the enterprise has to accept and adopt mean time to recovery as opposed to high availability numbers. Like, it's not about the number of nines you think you can attain. It's about how fast can we deliver features and how fast can we recover if there is an issue detected.
Yep. No, 100% correct. Yeah, there's I always forget the name of it, but there's some manifesto out there that talks about building, modern applications today for scale and reliability, and it makes a super point, which is, every component should assume that anything using it is going to act to damage it, to take it down, to abuse it in some way, and also assume that anything it depends on might not be there. And if every component has a strategy for both cases, you can build a much more reliable system. And that just goes back to the comments I was making before about architecture. Like, this in order to have a mean time to recover, you've built an architecture which you're deploying on that allows for those smaller changes, that allows for those rapid releases, that allows you to quickly identify if something isn't behaving appropriately, and that allows you to switch back to a known state that you're happy with in a repeatable, meaningful way. All critical parts of the automation strategy, but just development strategy in general.
It sounds a lot like riding an old Harley, where you have to assume that everyone's trying to kill you, including the machine you're sitting on.
Yeah, and wear a helmet.
And I would just posit that part of the reason why things have been like this for so long is because the application developers had assumed that the faults lie in the infrastructure itself and that the infrastructure operations teams were the ones that needed to go fix it. And when I just, from my networking background, when you look at the number of dumb things that we've come up with to fix layer 2 first hop reachability over the years, because applications don't understand that if there's a connectivity loss, you need to re-arc for your gateway, or worse, why do you even need one? That when we have finally standardized the infrastructure to the point where it's solid, everything works, you're not going to replumb AWS because that network is 99% certain to be working. Now the application developers are having to go back and go, well, wait a minute, you mean I have to build my app so that it works no matter what? And I can't just say, go fix this thing that doesn't work now? I mean, that is a radical shift in the way that they think about things. And I think that it actually makes them more aware of the dependencies that they're having to draw from.
Well, I think at least obviously better quality software if you're holding the people who need to utilize these services accountable to making sure they've got the right availability. I mean, it's interesting because we've moved up the stack, right, from layer 1 through whatever. We're up at the application layer now. Everything at the application layer is going to have to be able to gracefully retry or gracefully fall back, or you have to plan that in as part of the application development. And it's interesting because how many times you run into like hard coded IP addresses in applications. I mean, this is insane. Like, I'm sorry, developer, and I'm a developer. We can do better. Like, that's not acceptable. We have things like DNS, and actually, you can use DNS in a dynamic fashion. Like, we can have service discovery. You can now just kind of know that if I call out to the Redis name inside this cluster, I will get a hold of the right thing.
Yeah, and it's not just that. It's not just hard-coded addresses. It's, putting DNS names to check for things like captive portals on your workstation. Well, then someone retires that DNS name and now it doesn't resolve and everything breaks. And we didn't know that it was a function of that. And it goes back to that institutional knowledge of, oh, hey, nobody retire captive.apple.com because that's still used by a whole bunch of machines out there. And so we need to have a way to commit that to memory and to create dependencies upon that so that we know, oh, hey, I got to go check the source of truth. And it says that, the source of truth, of course, not being the dragon in the data center, but being the living document that says, yeah, we've deployed all of these solutions in this system to take care of this aspect over here. And here's the plan for retiring that if things go south. But, don't muck around with this. How many times have we read code that has comments at the top that say, don't touch this string, it works, and I don't know why.
Well, and that's the beauty of your infrastructure as code. You can now put those comments right alongside the configuration of that infrastructure.
Hopefully not the yellow tape comment saying, we don't know how this works, it just works, don't
Right.
touch it. But for sure, by the way, another tip is don't name any host local host. That can cause some pretty special impact depending on network. Yeah, but all of that stuff, do not do this, do not do that. Look, that's part of the institutional knowledge. The other part of the institutional knowledge is just the vendor side. For instance, we invested in this API gateway, yada yada yada. And the point of it is to try to abstract APIs to sort of a business level. And one of the first customers was a big retail customer of ours, and they're doing a massive migration from data center to cloud or whatever the case was. And in our DDI tool, that meant doing like these 11 things. Exposing the user who was trying to orchestrate this across a number of different systems, in this case, I think it was being orchestrated via ServiceNow, to those 11 things would have been exposing the inside of how a vendor-specific application works that is well beyond the knowledge that the developer should have to have in order to do this. And therefore, that means, from our perspective, being able to bubble that stuff up into a single API that just move server. That's business level. Like that's, it's move server, server name, IP address, new server name, new IP address, whatever it was, whatever the 4 arguments were. And then, the application receiving that API should absorb all of the complexity or the vendor specific stuff, and then the protocol, the esoteric stuff about how DNS might work or anything else. Like, they don't care. They're just trying to move a server, and they want that, to happen automatically. And so I think we also often need to think of the users of the APIs and what their expected knowledge might be when they start the process, because it's nobody wants to learn another API. Somebody, I think Calvin, as you mentioned Terraform before, and like for us, that means doing things like making sure that we have appropriate, Terraform. I'm going to say plugins, and at this
Modules.
point,
Yeah, the modules.
Modules. Thank you.
Yeah.
So that we can, so that our customers can, add a host record or whatever they need to do in the tooling that they're learning to do their job versus learning a vendor specific API.
Yeah. No, I think it just comes down to less is more. They need to be still need to be human friendly APIs where it does the one, kind of one trick pony, like gets back to the little Unix philosophy here. Build one endpoint that does one simple thing, so that it's less likely you can mess it up by passing in or missing arguments or fat
Right.
fingering something. I mean, how many database outages were caused by the computers? Probably about none. Most of them are caused by some human fat fingering a command while they were trying to like fix something.
Yep. Agreed.
Right. Well, I mean, I think we've discussed quite a bit around, this idea that institutional knowledge needs to be captured and that there's a lot of things that we need to be able to rely on. And I love this idea of creating living documents that we can constantly update and know that they're current and things like that. So with the fact that we're driving toward automation, with this idea that we know we're going to have to get there soon, as Chris alluded to, we need to become managers of bots instead of bots ourselves. What's the one thing that people listening to this podcast who are in the practitioner space that are thinking about implementing some form of automation, what's the one pitfall that you think that they need to be aware of when it comes to things like institutional knowledge that they need to start preparing for now so that it won't come up and bite them like the dragon in the data center?
I gotta pick one. Like that's a crazy idea to pick one
Mhm.
thing. Um, I think it does come down to good documentation. If you want to start now, you need to go through and document a lot of those processes, or transform them into code. Start off with pseudocode and get this into infrastructure as code, but the process is still going to be documentation. There's no substitute for, I can't, you know, Vulcan mind meld an employee and extract every last piece of information, because they won't know what you don't know and they're not telling you.
Yeah, and that I think expands to dependencies and kind of building these trees out, which I think one of the things we've kind of talked around is not just this kind of tribal knowledge, but just this kind of tacit knowledge of the grizzled old Sam who's been putting printers on the network for so long. He knows which ports to use and which ports not to use, and he goes through a lot of like troubleshooting almost on the fly in his own mind, and that is what needs to be kind of put into code eventually, right? So first kind of map it out and understand what are those decision processes, right? How did he decide not to use port 2 and to use port 3? I mean, it's a really silly example, but I think this applies to almost anything operational that you've gone and done. There are these decisions that you're making kind of on the fly without even thinking about it that really do need to be documented and then tied back, to Calvin's point, to the business process and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think part of that also is start smaller. I mean, I think the idea of trying to make everything automatable, especially areas that maybe there's no benefit right now to automate, well, great. Documentation for sure. Get this. I always think about it like, whatever thought process somebody goes through when they get the help desk, like the remedy ticket or whatever, to actually doing it. Like, yeah, that's the knowledge we need out there. But but it's super expensive to try to retrofit everything when not everything needs to be automated today. That doesn't mean the next time you re-architect or whatever the case, great, but find areas where you can start experimenting. Huge proponent in experimentation, and even that is hard sometimes in traditional IT infrastructure. Like even to put a lab together, gets difficult. Like experimentation is king, and then also again, um, you know, whether cliche or not, don't boil the ocean. Like, get started.
Completely agree with that. Start small. And I think if you do start small, it enables you to do some interesting things like put in automated testing around those automations. Sounds a little meta, but once you have that automated testing, you can now wipe out your initial implementation, rebuild something, and you have a test you can run against it to ensure that you're going to get the same effect.
Absolutely, totally agree.
All right. Well, I think this has been a fascinating discussion around a lot of the things that people need to be aware of. Andrew, since you're a special guest from BlueCat, you guys obviously have a number of solutions that might be able to fit the bill for what people are kind of taking a look at when it comes to making these platform decisions. What's the best place to go to learn a little bit more about some of the things that you are working on?
BlueCatNetworks.com. Just hit up our website. We've got, and then our YouTube channel and I mean, we try to post as many videos as possible to describe what we're doing, and get involved in the discussion. We actually have an open Slack channel, not just for BlueCat users, called Network VIP, where we try to drive a lot of these discussions as well. And you can find out how to join on our website. That is, where we just want vendor agnostic discussions on this, because with real meaty examples and conversations we can have.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for being a part of this episode, specifically Andrew from BlueCat and our friends there for bringing you this roundtable. And I also want to thank each and every one of our community members out there for listening in and offering your commentary and your observations. If you want to learn more about some of the great stuff that we do here, some more great technology discussions around IT practitioners, please make sure you head over to gestaltit.com. Check out some of our articles. You can also check out our YouTube channel at youtube.com/gestaltit video for more great roundtables and other podcasts like this. But for myself, Tom Hollingsworth, for our great panelists, for our friends from BlueCat, and for the rest of our Gestalt IT community, thank you very much for tuning in, and we hope to be speaking with you again soon.